Eleanor Vance made a powerful judge, who seemed untouchable, kneel for 3 minutes. What happened in that courtroom will leave you stunned. A fierce confrontation, secrets exposed, and corruption within the judicial system laid bare. What did Eleanor do to shake the very foundations of the system? Does she have the courage to face these dark forces head-on? The courtroom gleamed with bright, yellowish light reflecting off the cold, imposing walls. Yet the air felt heavy, like a steel cage stifling any hope that might have existed. Every footstep echoed like the ticking of a countdown clock. The audience, the lawyers, the witnesses, and the officials sat in silence, each holding their breath, their eyes fixed on Judge Alastair Finch, who over the years had become the symbol of power in this very courtroom. Judge Alastair Finch, a man with silver hair, a thick beard, and cold eyes as hard as ice, strode into the room. Each of his steps echoed with authority, commanding respect. As he entered, everyone in the room stood in unison, paying tribute to a man who was not just a judge, but a figure of significant influence in the judicial system. Yet, there was no warmth in Finch's eyes, no calmness or understanding. Instead, his gaze was filled with disdain, a look that seemed to look down on everyone in the room, as if he was above them all. He took his seat behind the judge's desk, gesturing for everyone to sit down, and began flipping through the papers on his table. The room fell into an eerie silence, everyone knowing this would be another session where Finch would freely display his oppressive attitude. This was no fair court, but a place where power was manipulated, and those affected by it never stood a chance. As the oppressive atmosphere loomed over the room, the door to the courtroom suddenly opened, and in walked Eleanor Vance. There was no sound, no change in the air, but instantly all eyes turned to her, a tall, elegantly dressed woman. Yet nothing in her attire could hide the confidence and determination in her eyes. Eleanor Vance, with her sharp, piercing gaze and her stride as firm as a warrior, entered the courtroom with a presence that words could hardly describe. She was a woman who dared to face what most would never dare to challenge. In this justice system, where power and money control decisions, Eleanor was not one to submit, but one who would rise and confront it without fear. Her steps seemed to glide lightly across the floor, but each step only heightened the tension in the room. The crowd could not ignore her entrance. Those seated near the observation table exchanged surprised glances at her absolute confidence. She showed no fear in the face of Judge Finch's cold stare or his air of contempt. Instead, her eyes challenged him, as though telling him, "Justice cannot be manipulated by people like you." As she approached the table, Eleanor said nothing. She simply placed a thick file on the table before Finch. This was no ordinary file. Inside were the truths, irrefutable evidence of the corruption and crimes Finch had hidden for years. But what no one knew was that these papers held the key to unlocking the downfall of one of the most powerful figures in the judicial system. Finch, feeling the challenge in Eleanor's gaze, took a deep breath, trying to suppress his rising frustration. He didn't like her presence, didn't like the way she looked at him, as if she knew all his dark secrets. But he didn't show weakness. Instead, he clenched his jaw and gripped the judge's gavel, ready to begin the trial. Eleanor locked eyes with Finch, unwavering, never blinking, never hesitating. She knew this was the most important moment of her life. Today, she would face those who held the fate of countless lives in their hands, those who had exploited this system to trample on the innocent. And today, Eleanor would be the one to expose the truth, refusing to let the injustice continue. The moment Eleanor Vance placed the thick file down on the table in front of Judge Finch, he didn't waste a second to express his disdain. His cold, piercing eyes locked onto Eleanor as if she were nothing more than a pawn in a petty political game. Judge Alastair Finch could no longer tolerate Eleanor's presence for even another second. The atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to freeze in a tense, unbearable moment. Finch, with his sharp gaze and voice like steel, pushed his mockery even further. He looked Eleanor up and down, his lips curling into a sneer filled with pure contempt. "Well, who do we have here?" Finch sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "A political puppet from the Conservatives? A young girl with no clue about facing the truth, just following the powerful and blindly accepting whatever they tell her? You think you can do anything in this room?" The entire room fell silent, the tension thickening with each passing second. Everyone present in the courtroom turned their attention to Eleanor, waiting to see how she would handle the degrading words from someone with absolute power like Finch. Judge Finch raised his hand, pointing directly at Eleanor, his voice booming like a threat. "Who do you think you are? A supporter of Trump or something greater? A puppet trying to expose in this room? You think you can come here and expose me?" Finch lifted his chin, his eyes challenging her as if she had no right to stand in his courtroom. "Who are you to stand before me? Just a mouthpiece spreading nonsense and fabrications for the conservative agenda? You don't belong here. You don't understand justice. You're just a political tool, a puppet." Finch's words grew more aggressive, his voice carrying a venomous contempt that could no longer be concealed. Facing this provocation, Eleanor Vance didn't flinch. Her expression remained unchanged, but in her eyes, resilience and determination swelled like never before. Eleanor knew this was the moment to tear down the walls of power that Finch had built for years. Finch noticed the shift in her, and it only fueled his anger further. He gripped the gavel tightly, slamming it onto the desk with force. The sound echoed in the room like a warning. "You have no right to criticize me. Who are you to lecture me about justice? You're just a servant to the wealthy, a person unworthy of being in this courtroom." Finch's mockery grew sharper, and he no longer made an attempt to conceal the contempt in his voice. Every word he spoke felt like a knife aimed at Eleanor's soul. The crowd in the courtroom could only watch in stunned silence, some in shock, others feeling the overwhelming sense of injustice filling the room. Eleanor Vance stood motionless, not a single sign of wavering. Not once did she lower her head or shrink from the attack. She understood this wasn't just a confrontation between two people. It was a battle between truth and power, and she would not let Finch easily overpower her. An eerie silence filled the courtroom. All eyes were fixed on Eleanor, waiting for her response. No one had ever dared to confront Finch directly like this before. Eleanor Vance stood resolutely, facing Judge Alastair Finch. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, simply locked her gaze on him with cold, unwavering determination. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if the very air itself had paused. There was no sound, no shifting in the seats, only an intense silence, as if everyone in the room was waiting for something. Waiting for Eleanor to make her move, for Finch to crack, for the truth to come spilling out. Finch, though the anger was beginning to boil inside him, couldn't help but feel a flicker of unease. His usual self-assurance was starting to waver, but his pride wouldn't let him show weakness. He cleared his throat, trying to maintain his posture, the ever-composed figure of a man in absolute control. Yet deep within him, a gnawing sense of vulnerability was beginning to rise, one he could no longer ignore. For the first time in years, Finch felt like he was standing on shaky ground, and it frightened him. Eleanor ever remained utterly calm. She reached into her leather briefcase with slow, deliberate movements. The file she pulled out was thick, bulging with pages. This wasn't just another folder of inconsequential documents. No, these were the weapons she had come here with, the irrefutable evidence, the smoking gun that Finch had been trying to keep hidden for so long. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a damning record of years of corruption, illegal dealings, and political manipulation. With deliberate precision, Eleanor placed the file on the table, but she didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she stood still, looking down at the file as if giving it the weight it deserved. Her eyes never left Finch, not even for a second. She was like a hunter poised to strike, but not rushing. Every second in this moment counted. She knew that this was her time, the time when she would make the man who'd spent years exploiting his power face the consequences of his actions. The tension in the room was unbearable. You could almost feel the collective pulse of every person present, each of them wondering what would happen next. The whole courtroom seemed to hang on the edge of uncertainty. Finch, despite being the one in control, began to feel like a man backed into a corner. His eyes shifted slightly, and he clenched his jaw. Eleanor's presence was starting to unravel him. For a long moment, Eleanor didn't speak. She simply let the silence stretch out, thickening the air with anticipation. Every second seemed to stretch on endlessly, and with each second, Finch felt more and more exposed, as if the very walls of the courtroom were closing in on him. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice calm but full of authority. like a judge pronouncing a sentence that had already been decided. "I'm not here just to testify today," Eleanor said, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'm here to break the silence you've built up over all these years." Her words landed like a bombshell. The room was silent, but now there was a different kind of silence, one filled with shock and awe. The weight of what she had just said hung in the air, making it impossible to ignore. A battle had begun, but this wasn't a typical courtroom exchange. This was something deeper, something more profound. For years, Finch had sat behind his judge's desk, making decisions that favored only the wealthy and powerful, people who could pay for justice, people who could manipulate the system for their own gain. He had built an empire of corruption, using his position to keep his secrets hidden and to ensure that those who threatened to expose him were crushed under the weight of his power. But today, standing before him was a woman who wasn't intimidated by him, wasn't afraid of his threats. She wasn't there just to take him down in court. She was there to expose everything, to tear apart the system he had used to keep the truth buried. The audience felt it, the shift. The air had thickened. Curiosity surged through them like a wave. They knew they were witnessing something monumental. The question on everyone's mind was clear. Could Eleanor Vance actually do it? Could she take down someone as powerful as Judge Finch, someone who had spent years manipulating the system for his own benefit? Could she succeed where so many others had failed? Or would she be crushed by the same corrupt system she was trying to dismantle? Eleanor's hands remained steady, her fingers brushing lightly over the edges of the file. She didn't rush to open it. No, she knew that every movement she made had a purpose. Every gesture, every word, every piece of evidence she presented had to count. This wasn't just about presenting facts. It was about breaking down the walls of the corruption that had been built over years. Her fingers slowly turned the first page. The courtroom held its collective breath. March 15th, 2024. Eleanor read aloud, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The Faith and Family Foundation met with donors in Manchester, New Hampshire. All contributions were publicly and transparently recorded. There were no signs of any fraud. Eleanor paused, letting her words sink in. The room was deathly quiet, as if everyone was trying to absorb the magnitude of what she was presenting. She glanced briefly at Finch, whose face had now taken on a darker shade. His lips were pressed tightly together, his eyes narrowed. There was no smugness left, just unease. "Do you want me to continue?" Eleanor asked, her tone calm but challenging. It wasn't a request, it was an invitation, a challenge, a declaration of war. And in that moment, the focus of the entire courtroom was on one person, Eleanor Vance. Every eye was on her, waiting for her next move, waiting for the truth to continue pouring out, one fact at a time. Finch's grip on the gavel tightened, his knuckles turning white. The power he once held so confidently was slipping through his fingers. He was losing control, and he knew it. Eleanor wasn't just standing up to him. She was standing up to everything he represented. His empire of power, lies, and corruption was beginning to crack under the weight of her truth. And Eleanor knew that this was only the beginning. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The atmosphere in the courtroom had grown so tense it was suffocating. The clatter of keyboards, the gavel striking, and the murmur of the audience had all faded into the background. All eyes were on Eleanor Vance, the only woman in the room daring to face the powerful Judge Alastair Finch. She stood there in the thick, palpable tension, holding the file, irrefutable evidence of Finch's shady financial dealings. Eleanor began turning to the next page, and each word in the document seemed to pierce the air. All eyes were fixed on her, as if they were witnessing a battle for survival where only the truth could emerge victorious. She read with a steady but sharp voice, unhurried, as if every word she spoke was deliberate, designed to ensure that Finch could not deny the truth. March 18th, 2024. A sum of $250,000 was transferred from Liberty Fund to Judge Alastair Finch's account at the Cayman Islands Bank. This transfer occurred immediately after Finch made the decision to suspend the case of a conservative organization that had received backing from Liberty Fund. Eleanor's voice rang out like a stern accusation, emotionless, yet beneath it lay an unwavering resolve. She paused briefly, allowing her words to settle into the minds of the people in the room. Each word, each number, was not just a statistic. It was a living testament to the corruption and manipulation of power Finch had long concealed. The room became unnervingly quiet, as if everyone was afraid that speaking out would cause the truth to slip away. Eleanor continued to turn the pages, the evidence unfolding before them like a map leading directly to Finch's downfall. May 22, 2024. $500,000 was transferred into Finch's account after he issued a ruling in favor of a major oil company, a company that had pledged to fund the campaigns of conservative senators. Finch couldn't help but hear these words. He sat motionless, his hands gripping the gavel so tightly his fingertips turned white from the strain. His eyes, once cold and controlled, now showed signs of anxiety. His calm facade was cracking. Despite his efforts to remain composed, a flicker of panic and discomfort could not be concealed. These numbers were like heavy stones being thrown at him, each one chipping away at the fortress he had built. A conservative organization, an oil company, all had money, and all that money had flowed through his account. Eleanor didn't stop there. She turned another page, each financial transaction like a devastating blow to Finch's power. July 30th, 2024. $1 million from Liberty Fund was transferred into Finch's account just as he issued a ruling to reduce the sentence of a weapons manufacturing corporation that had donated to his re-election campaign. Each of Eleanor's words was like a punch landing with brutal precision, making the tension in the room thicker with each passing moment. The evidence was undeniable, a network of power and money laid bare in the very courtroom where Finch had once ruled supreme. The people in the courtroom couldn't take their eyes off Eleanor. There was a palpable sense of suspense and curiosity in the air. The dark secrets Finch had worked so hard to keep hidden were now being exposed for all to see. Each piece of evidence was like an overture signaling the beginning of the end for this powerful man. Eleanor didn't look back at Finch, but she could feel his panicked gaze burning into her. Finch was beginning to stiffen, his hands gripping the edge of the desk, as though he were trying to hold on to something, anything. But there was nothing that could save him now. So, Judge Finch, Eleanor continued, her voice measured but unwavering. How do you explain these transfers? She paused again, giving him no room to breathe, no space to escape. She locked eyes with him, her challenge hanging in the air like a sword over his head, making it clear to everyone in the room that the truth had him cornered. He could no longer hide from it. The walls were closing in, and this time there would be no escape. The courtroom was drowned in a suffocating silence. Every eye was locked on Eleanor as she continued to turn the pages of the file, seemingly unstoppable in her steady, determined progress. The numbers, the documents, the irrefutable transactions were slowly but surely revealing the truth Finch had desperately tried to hide for years. Eleanor stood tall, her hands gripping the file tightly, her cold, sharp eyes never leaving Judge Alastair Finch. She had prepared herself for this moment, knowing that each word she spoke would strike directly at the foundation of the power Finch had built. Her accusations weren't empty. They were the revelation of dishonest actions, wrong decisions that had caused untold suffering to countless innocent victims. A gentle breeze from the open window swept through the room, causing the papers on the table to flutter, but the courtroom remained eerily still. Only the occasional sigh of the audience could be heard. Everyone in the room was hanging on Eleanor's every word, fully aware that something monumental was unfolding before them. Eleanor raised her hand, gently tapping the file, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. She began to read, her voice calm yet resolute, unhurried, as if each word she spoke had one clear purpose, to ensure that Finch couldn't deny the truth. Judge Alastair Finch, the man you all thought was the symbol of justice, is actually the one who has manipulated this very system of justice. He is the one who has handed down wrongful rulings based on money, power, and bribes. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Every pair of eyes now fixated on Finch, who sat in his judge's chair, gripping the gavel. He tried to maintain a stoic expression, but beneath it, the tide of panic was beginning to rise. His eyes blinked briefly, and his lips tightened, trying to suppress the words that were threatening to spill out. But Eleanor, with the unwavering resolve of a warrior, continued. Finch took bribes from Liberty Fund to alter rulings in favor of conservative organizations, oil companies, and the wealthy. all while innocent people suffered the consequences of his decisions. At this point, Eleanor's words were no longer mere accusations. They were a direct declaration of war. The courtroom was rocked by her statement. The audience began to whisper, their eyes filled with doubt as they turned to Finch. The truth was finally surfacing, and no one could look away. She pressed on without hesitation. He reduced the sentence for a major weapons manufacturing company in exchange for $500,000. He suspended a corruption case after receiving $1 million in donations from conservative organizations. Eleanor paused, allowing her words to hang heavily in the air. The atmosphere in the courtroom suddenly became unnervingly still. Only the soft breaths of the people in the room broke the silence. Everyone could feel the tension with every sentence that passed her lips. Finch, who once prided himself on his power, was now being methodically exposed for every mistake and crime he had concealed for years. Eleanor raised her head, her gaze sharp as a blade, showing no fear or hesitation in the face of the growing panic that was beginning to show in Finch's eyes. This was no ordinary conversation. This was a confrontation between justice and corruption. Eleanor's next words hit with the force of a sledgehammer, leaving the courtroom stunned. This is not an accusation. This is the truth. Her voice rang out like a firm declaration, impossible to deny. She had presented the evidence, the irrefutable documents, and now everyone in the room had to face the truth. There would be no defense for Finch. The crimes he had committed were no longer a secret buried in the shadows. Everything had been laid bare, and nothing could change that. The courtroom was submerged in a tense silence, suffocating and heavy. The only sound now was the faint tapping of the gavel, no longer resonating with the authority it once held. Judge Alastair Finch, a man who had always been synonymous with unshakable confidence and complete control, now sat frozen in his seat, his face gradually changing color. A sense of unease slowly began to overtake Finch with every word Eleanor read aloud, each piece of evidence she revealed. It was as though an arrow was piercing the very foundation of the power he had carefully constructed over the years. Finch, who had once held all the contempt and dominance in this courtroom, now found himself being swept into the whirlpool of his own impending collapse. Justice, which he had once believed he could manipulate his entire life, was now turning back against him. Sweat began to bead on Finch's forehead, and the sharp coldness in his eyes had vanished. His eyes now reflected panic, a raw, uncontained distress, as he realized that not only Eleanor, but the entire courtroom was staring at him, waiting for an explanation he could no longer provide. Eleanor didn't miss a beat. She continued to turn the pages of the file, continuing to shed light on each shady transaction, every bribe Finch had taken, the decisions he had made for money and power. Each number was a direct accusation, and every page of the document was irrefutable proof. Finch could not bear it any longer. His fist slammed down on the gavel, the sound echoing through the room, startling everyone. The gavel strike, however, lacked its usual authority, instead sounding more like a futile attempt to suppress the inevitable, a desperate outburst of frustration that could no longer be hidden. "Do you know what you're doing?" Finch growled, his voice trembling, no longer the cold, controlled tone that had once defined him. He had lost all semblance of control. His words were a feeble resistance, incapable of pushing back the evidence Eleanor had laid bare. "This is not how you can overthrow me. I'm the judge. I decide justice here. Not you. Not anyone else." Each of Finch's words made the atmosphere in the courtroom even more suffocating. He tried to fight back, but the clear sense of frustration in his voice only amplified the confusion that had taken root in the minds of the people present. Finch could no longer face the truth. He couldn't maintain his facade any longer, for the very truth was pushing him into a corner from which there was no escape. Eleanor remained unhurried. She slowly turned toward him, her gaze still as sharp as a blade. "You can't keep deceiving all of us any longer, Judge Finch. These pieces of evidence are irrefutable. You've manipulated everything for your personal gain, and justice will not allow you to continue this way." Eleanor's words were not just simple criticism. They were a direct challenge to Judge Finch, a man who had never faced someone daring enough to confront him like this. And now, Eleanor Vance had done exactly that, stripping him of the absolute power he had once held in this courtroom. Finch began to unravel. His hands shook uncontrollably. Sweat streamed down his forehead. His eyes darted around the room as though searching for help, but there was no one who could save him now. He could no longer deny the evidence. The crimes he had committed were now laid bare before everyone. "This is not something you can win," Finch shouted, but his voice no longer carried the strength it once did. It had weakened, trembled with fear. "You don't know who I am. I'm the judge," he screamed, as though he were on the verge of losing everything, like a wild animal trapped in a cage, desperately trying to escape the trap of his own making. Eleanor Vance refused to let him continue. She took another step forward, her gaze unflinching. "You are not justice. You are a coward hiding behind power. And today, I will show you that no one can escape the truth forever." In that moment, Finch's helplessness and fear were no longer hidden. He had lost all ability to control the situation, and now he stood before the court of his own actions, with no chance of denying the truth any longer. In the tense atmosphere of the courtroom, where every word spoken by Eleanor Vance struck like a blade against Judge Alastair Finch's arrogance, a moment of silence filled the room. But then, a distant memory began to fade into Eleanor's mind, one she had never forgotten, no matter how much time had passed. It was in the early days when Eleanor first stepped into the judicial system, a young woman brimming with passion, eager to uncover the truth. She could still remember her first day in court, the way the lights from above illuminated her face, the way each word she spoke carried a deep belief in justice. At that time, Eleanor truly believed that this system would always protect the truth and the innocent, that every decision made would be based on sound principles. But soon, she began to witness something else. Cases being manipulated, decisions being made based on personal gain, phone calls between lawyers and judges, secret deals that no one dared speak of. She saw how those in power twisted justice for their own profit, protecting their interests while the innocent were left to suffer the consequences. A system that was distorted, where money and power ruled instead of fairness. Eleanor recalled one case she had been involved with early in her career, an innocent man wrongfully convicted of a crime he did not commit. He was pressured into pleading guilty because the corrupt judges and lawyers wanted to relieve the pressure from those with money. Eleanor saw the rot within the system, where justice was bought and sold behind closed doors, and the victims, those innocent lives, had no recourse. She could not accept this. The anger she felt witnessing these miscarriages of justice, watching innocent people's lives ruined for personal gain, pushed Eleanor to a critical decision. She could not stand idly by and watch justice be manipulated like this. She couldn't live as someone who simply followed orders without ever standing up against the evil around her. So she made the choice to leave, abandoning the lucrative opportunities in her past for a path fraught with challenges and hardships. Eleanor became part of the movement to protect the truth, to stand against the power structures that thrived on corruption, no matter how dangerous or tempting the stakes were. Like a warrior, she began gathering the evidence, collecting the documents that the decaying system had tried to bury. But the most pivotal moment in her journey came when she witnessed the manipulation of Judge Finch, once someone she believed to be a staunch figure of justice, but now revealed as a man who had sold his soul for personal gain, who turned a blind eye to innocent victims just for power and money. That was when Eleanor made the resolute decision to face Finch, to stand up and expose everything he had done, and to fight for justice for those who had been harmed. With that determination, Eleanor meticulously prepared every detail. No longer was she the idealistic young girl, but a strong woman, a warrior ready to do whatever it took to bring down a corrupt system and restore justice to the innocent. Now, in the courtroom, the air grew heavier with every passing second. Eleanor stood firm before Finch, but in her mind, the faces of innocent victims, people who had been pushed to the brink by the manipulation of those like Finch, flashed before her clearer than ever. This wasn't just a battle between her and Finch. This was a battle for justice, for truth, and for the lives of those trampled by the system. This was why Eleanor was here, not just to testify, but to break open a corrupt system that had caused so many to suffer. And today, she would ensure that all of these secrets were exposed under the light of justice. The courtroom remained submerged in a tense silence. Everyone's eyes were fixed on Eleanor. She continued presenting irrefutable evidence of Finch's shady transactions, his manipulation of the judicial system. With each word she spoke, the panic and fear in Finch's eyes became more evident, making his unease impossible to ignore. But just as she was reading another document, a colleague unexpectedly entered the courtroom. He walked briskly, his face anxious, eyes betraying his nervousness. It was clear he had sensed the tension in the room and realized this wasn't just an ordinary trial. This was a battle between justice and corruption, between a determined woman and a system that the entire nation was now facing. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice laced with concern, the fear in his words unmistakable. "You can't go up against Finch like this. You can't do anything more. The forces behind him are too powerful. If you continue, not only will you put yourself in danger, but you'll destroy your career." The entire room seemed to hold its breath, the air growing even heavier. Eleanor paused for a moment, stopping her reading of the documents, but she did not turn to face her colleague. Her gaze remained locked onto Finch, unwavering. The accusations she had already made were not just the first victory in this battle. They were a declaration of justice, a fight that she could not walk away from. "I can't stand by while justice is trampled, while innocent people continue to suffer under this corruption. Finch and people like him have manipulated this judicial system for far too long," Eleanor responded, her voice steady, unwavering in its resolve. "You can be worried, but I cannot let these people in power continue to run roughshod over everything." Her colleague looked at her, his face still full of concern, as if searching for some reason, some answer that might convince Eleanor to abandon this path. "But you don't understand, Eleanor. They can destroy you, ruin everything you've worked for. Finch isn't the only one you're facing. The people behind him will do whatever it takes to maintain their power." Eleanor did not falter. Her eyes remained sharp, unyielding in the face of her colleague's fear. "If I don't do it, who will? I can't live in a world where justice is manipulated, cases are ruined, the innocent are left to suffer, all because of power and money. This cannot continue." Her words rang out clearly in the courtroom, each one reinforcing her unwavering commitment. She understood the forces threatening her, but she also knew she could not let fear stop her. Today was not about her. It was about the innocent people being crushed under this system. "I cannot stop. I cannot turn back. And I will not let him continue manipulating justice any longer." She turned to face her colleague, her eyes steadfast and resolute. "This is a fight that cannot be avoided, and I will fight until justice is served." The tension in the courtroom was so thick it felt as if it could be cut with a knife. Not a sound could be heard, only the heavy breathing of those watching every step Eleanor Vance took. Every eye was on her. Her accusations had been made, her evidence exposed, but Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. She couldn't stop now, not when everything had just started to unfold. Eleanor took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest, her gaze never leaving Finch, who sat at the judge's bench with a pale, drawn face, his lips pressed tight, as though he were desperately trying to find a way to escape the relentless assault she was launching against him. Without hesitation, she pulled out a thick file. Walking boldly to the front of the bench, she flipped to the next page and began to read aloud. April 2nd, 2024. A phone call from Alastair Finch to a representative of Liberty Fund, in which he requested financial support for the campaigns of conservative senators, promising to assist their projects, including cases that would benefit their organizations. Eleanor paused, her eyes locking onto Finch's. "You used your power to trade favors, to protect the wealthy, regardless of justice." Eleanor continued, each word like a sharp arrow piercing Finch's chest. April 15th, 2024. Finch sent another email to Liberty Fund, asking them to send more money for a project linked to conservative organizations. He wrote that he would assist these organizations in cases to secure further support for his campaign. These words rang out like a powerful accusation, something Finch could not deny. The documents Eleanor was reading were undeniable proof of the connection between Finch and Liberty Fund. With just these phone calls and emails, Eleanor had revealed the corruption Finch had spent years hiding. Finch's composure began to crack. His fingers clenched around the gavel, but the trembling in his hand was uncontrollable. His entire body was drenched in sweat, and his eyes, once cold and unflinching, now showed signs of panic. Finch was beginning to unravel. "This is not a game, Judge Finch," Eleanor's voice rang out, sharp and resolute. She took another step closer to him, causing the entire room to hold its breath. This is the truth, and you can no longer deny it. The calls, the emails, they are all proof that you sold out justice to protect your personal interests. Finch tried to bark out a response, but the confidence that had once defined him was now gone. This is a scam. You can't do this to me, he shouted, his voice filled with anger and desperation. You're trying to bring me down, but you can't win. Eleanor remained unshaken. She smiled lightly, but her eyes were filled with an unyielding determination. You're bringing yourself down, Judge Finch. I'm just doing my job. Justice will never compromise with fraud and corruption. And today, you will pay for what you've done. Eleanor didn't turn away but could feel the weight of the room's gaze upon her, the tension, the admiration building in their eyes. Each step she took, each piece of evidence she presented, made Finch's position more unstable. The entire courtroom seemed to become submerged in a life-or-death showdown where there was no place for deceit, only truth. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become heavy with tension, as if the truth was slowly emerging from the shadows. All eyes were fixed on Eleanor as she stepped forward, holding a small recording device, an essential tool in this fight. Everyone in the room understood that she was about to expose something Finch could never deny. This time, it wasn't just shady documents or incriminating emails. Eleanor had prepared something far more powerful, living proof. Eleanor didn't rush. She stood tall, her sharp eyes never leaving Finch's face, then slowly pressed the play button on the recorder. A few seconds later, Finch's voice echoed clearly through the courtroom, cutting through the air and intensifying the already thick atmosphere. Everyone in the room held their breath, understanding that this was the defining moment. Delete all the files related to Thompson's case. Those documents are no longer necessary. No one is allowed to know about them. Do you understand? Finch's voice in the recording was cold and commanding, as if he was the one in control of everything, and no one could stop him. Eleanor didn't look at Finch, but kept her gaze fixed on the recorder. Finch's voice rang out like a declaration of war, causing a ripple of murmur in the courtroom. People were stunned, unable to believe what they had just heard. This was irrefutable proof. Finch had ordered the destruction of critical documents, evidence that could expose the manipulation and injustice in the cases he had been involved in. This was the mark of power being abused, of truth being hidden for personal gain. Eleanor didn't stop there. She pressed play again, revealing another recording from one of her secret meetings. In it, Finch's voice could be heard once again, this time instructing someone else on how to destroy files related to illegal transactions and payments. I need you to handle the money transfers into my account quickly, without leaving any trace. Don't let anyone know about the donations from Liberty Fund, and make sure those documents never get out. Finch's tone was firm, unyielding, showing no signs of hesitation. This recording once again revealed the covert connections between him and the conservative organizations, the shady dealings Finch had tried to keep hidden. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak. People were shocked, struggling to comprehend that those they had believed to be champions of justice could be involved in such nefarious actions. Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on Finch, her gaze unwavering. Judge Finch, this is what you've been trying to conceal for so long. The calls, the secret meetings, and the orders to delete documents, all for one purpose: personal gain. You've manipulated justice, making the innocent suffer simply because of your greed. Finch sat frozen, his face pale, his hand clutching the gavel. He could no longer maintain the self-assurance he once had. His eyes, once cold and unflinching, now showed signs of fear and confusion. Finch had been caught by the very secrets he had created, and now there was no escape from what Eleanor had exposed. Eleanor continued, her voice calm but laced with undeniable strength. You can't keep deceiving justice like this, Judge Finch. This is the truth, and you can't run from it. She gripped the file tightly in her hand, not breaking her gaze from Finch. Every piece of evidence she had was a decisive blow to his power, one he could no longer deny. After Eleanor continued to present irrefutable recordings and documents, the courtroom held its breath, waiting for Finch's reaction. His gaze, once full of arrogance, was now replaced with evident confusion and fear. The entire room seemed to understand Finch no longer had any defense, no way to hide the crimes he had committed. Suddenly, Finch snapped out of his silence, his eyes turning red with anger, his hands clenched tightly around the gavel, as if with a single strike he could crush the truth Eleanor had laid bare. He was no longer the cold, composed judge but a man backed into a corner, desperately searching for a way out. "What are you doing?" Finch shouted, his voice rising to a frantic roar, his face flushed with fury, unable to contain the rage any longer. "You don't know who you're up against. You'll pay for these accusations, Eleanor." Each word from him was dripping with hate and threats, as if he thought he could overpower Eleanor with his fury. Eleanor stood her ground, unwavering, no sign of hesitation in her eyes. Everyone in the room could feel the strength and determination in her every step, as if she were walking into a battle she would never back down from. She faced Finch, her gaze sharp, never flinching from his, like a warrior facing her strongest enemy. "You can scream, you can threaten, but you can't hide the truth forever," Eleanor said calmly, her voice firm and resolute. "You can strip away every ounce of power, but you can't stop me from exposing everything. Justice will prevail." She wasn't afraid of his threats. Inside her was an unshakable resolve that nothing could change. Finch, feeling the deadlock and helplessness growing from within his anger, slammed the gavel down on the desk. But this time, the sound wasn't the powerful clang it once was. The gavel strike came down with an empty thud, lacking the force of a judge's authority, now only echoing the desperation of a man who had lost all control. "You don't understand," Finch shouted, his eyes filled with intense rage. "You'll regret doing this. You'll be arrested, and I will make you pay." His voice had transformed into a trembling, desperate cry of a man who knew he was at the end of the line. Eleanor didn't let him take another moment to retreat, to distract from the truth. She stepped forward, her voice steady, as if she was the one controlling the room. "You can lie, you can threaten, but you can't hide the truth forever," Eleanor said clearly, each word ringing out like a declaration. "Everything you've done, everything you've said, cannot obscure the truth I've presented. These pieces of evidence will make you pay." Finch could no longer respond. His eyes shifted to panic, as if he could see a part of himself crumbling before him. Eleanor's words were like hammer blows against his conscience, and there was nothing he could do to escape the reality unfolding before him. The courtroom was enveloped in a heavy, suffocating silence. The tension reached its peak. Every eye was fixed on Eleanor, standing strong before Judge Alastair Finch, once seen as an untouchable figure beyond challenge. But now, he was stripped of all power, and no trace of confidence remained in his eyes. All that was left was an unmistakable, palpable panic. Eleanor didn't need to do anything further. The evidence was undeniable: audio recordings, documents. Everything had been laid bare in the harsh light of truth. She remained silent, simply standing there, her eyes locked onto Finch, sharp as a knife, as though she could sever any excuse he might still be trying to form in his mind. Finch sat there pale, his hands still gripping the gavel but unable to act. He trembled, no longer from anger, but from the overwhelming confusion that had taken over him. Eleanor's words, the clear evidence she had presented, had completely stripped him of the ability to defend himself. He couldn't speak, couldn't offer any justification. The truth was too strong, and now he could only sit there in silence, like a man stripped of all his power. In the courtroom, no one dared to break the silence. They held their breath, barely moving, waiting to see what Finch would do next. The small sounds of life from outside seemed to vanish, replaced only by the thick, oppressive silence in the room, making the air feel heavy. Each second felt like a test for Finch as he realized the forces he had relied on for so long could no longer protect him. The courtroom felt like a still painting, frozen in time, only broken by the soft tapping of the gavel. But this time, it wasn't the forceful sound of power, it was the weak, desperate tap of failure, a sound that couldn't mask Finch's defeat. Those present began to understand what Finch couldn't deny. He had lost. There was no way out of the exposure now. Finch's eyes darted across the room, from one face to the next, but no one dared to meet his gaze anymore. The people who witnessed this scene could feel the defeat of a man who had once thought of himself as omnipotent. He was no longer the judge. He was no longer the one who could manipulate justice to his will. He was just a man caught, exposed in the light of truth. Eleanor didn't rush. She stood her ground, unwavering, like a warrior victorious over a cowardly enemy. She didn't need to say another word. The silence in the courtroom spoke for itself. Everyone knew that today, justice had won, and Finch would have to pay for his actions. The courtroom was still suffocating under the weight of tension. Finch sat there, unable to utter a single word of defense, unable to do anything against the overwhelming evidence Eleanor had presented. The recordings, documents, and secret meetings had exposed the truth about Finch, about the corruption he had hidden for so many years. There was no way for him to escape. His downfall seemed like a matter of time. And then, just as if fate itself had timed this moment perfectly, the courtroom doors suddenly swung open. A group of FBI agents, dressed in uniform, entered with an undeniable air of authority. Everyone in the room turned towards them, and in that instant, the tension in the air was shattered. The room erupted into murmurs, eyes wide with disbelief as the FBI agents moved forward. Then, all eyes fell on the leader, a senior agent, his FBI badge gleaming, with sharp, focused eyes. An arrest warrant was read aloud, cutting through the silence of the courtroom like thunder. Alastair Finch, for acts of corruption and bribery, we have a warrant for your immediate arrest. Immediately, a wave of emotion flooded the courtroom. The room erupted. Some stood and applauded. Others began to shout. They couldn't believe their eyes. The powerful judge, the man they once thought untouchable, was now being escorted out under the control of the FBI. The sounds of applause and shouts filled the air, and those witnessing the scene knew that at last, justice had triumphed. Finch couldn't believe what was happening. He stared at the FBI agent, his face pale, his mouth stammering, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His fingers gripped the gavel tightly, as though trying to find comfort in the symbol of his former power. But now, that gavel meant nothing. No one feared him anymore. "No, this can't be," Finch screamed, his eyes bloodshot with rage and panic. He leapt to his feet, losing all the confidence of the judge he once was. "You can't do this. I'm the judge. I have power." His voice was frantic, but his words only revealed his fear and desperation. But the FBI agent remained unmoved. He took a step forward, his tone calm and cold. "You'll come with us now, Finch. You have no power left." The words of the agent were final, and Finch had no choice but to face his downfall. He turned to flee, but his legs grew stiff, as though he no longer had the strength to move. Court staff rushed forward to stop him, restraining him and preventing his escape. Panic was evident in Finch's face as he realized that despite his position as a judge, no amount of power could shield him from the truth. Eleanor stood there unflinching, her eyes fixed on Finch, filled with unwavering resolve and pride. She had come this far, and now Finch would have to face the consequences of his actions. The courtroom could not contain the surge of excitement. The crowd clapped continuously, not out of a desire for revenge, but because they saw justice being served. They saw that a corrupt system had been defeated by courage and an undeniable truth. The scene in the courtroom was beyond words. Though Finch had been arrested by the FBI, and the air in the room had erupted with applause, shouts, and whispers, Eleanor stood still, as if she were an integral part of this historic moment. She watched Finch, the man she had only known through cases, wrongful decisions, and power manipulation. Now he was just a man being escorted under the control of the law, no longer the powerful Judge Alastair Finch whom everyone once feared. Eleanor's eyes carried no joy, no smug satisfaction. She wasn't seeking revenge or personal retribution. Her gaze was filled with pride and resilience. This was not her victory alone. It was the victory of justice, of truth. Eleanor observed Finch's every step as he was led out of the courtroom by two FBI agents. His face, no longer arrogant, was filled with despair and confusion. His hair was disheveled, his suit wrinkled. He no longer carried the image of a powerful judge, but was now nothing more than a man exposed to the light of truth. Each step he took reminded Eleanor of everything she had endured: sleepless nights, facing deceit, and the pain of watching innocent cases destroyed by those in power. She couldn't help but think back to the early days when she entered the judicial system full of ideals and passion, only to witness corruption, bad decisions, and the overwhelming injustice that plagued the system. The long journey had led her here, to this moment when everything had finally been exposed. But Eleanor didn't feel satisfaction. Even though the victory was hers today, the first step had been taken, but this was only the beginning of a long and arduous battle. She understood that what had just happened was only one small victory in the grand journey ahead. Finch could be arrested, but what about the other forces behind him? What about the others in the system she hadn't yet touched? Eleanor stood there, her eyes never leaving Finch as he was escorted out. She didn't feel a complete sense of triumph, but there was a calm and steadfast peace in her heart, knowing that today was a turning point. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the long fight she had chosen. She walked over to the corner of the room, her hands still gripping the file, feeling the weariness but also the strength within her. The road ahead was still long, but each small victory like this reminded her that the truth would always prevail, that justice would never be buried. She looked out at the door where the FBI agents were leading Finch away. Part of Eleanor felt a small pang of regret, a bit of sorrow for what had been lost, but for the most part, she felt pride. Justice had been served, and she had been at the forefront of this fight. The courtroom now lay in a heavy, suffocating silence. Finch was let out under the watchful eye of the FBI agents, and the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. People in the room were still in shock over what had just transpired, but Eleanor felt no satisfaction, nor did she rush to leave the room. She stood there motionless, her gaze fixed firmly on Finch, the man she had once feared, but who was now shackled by the truth. Finch, the powerful judge who once believed he was invincible, was now a defeated man. He walked out of the courtroom with his hands cuffed, head bowed, no longer embodying the pride of someone who sat on the throne of power. Everything he had worked for had crumbled, and now Finch was nothing more than a shadow of his former self. Eleanor remained still, her emotions calm, unwavering. Yes, she had won this battle, but in her mind, the war was not over. The forces behind Finch had yet to be defeated. But regardless of what was to come, today was a victory she had fought long and hard for. Before leaving, she turned back one last time to look at Finch. A faint glimmer of light passed through her eyes, a strength shining through, yet not an arrogance. This was not a personal triumph. It was the triumph of justice, of what was right. Eleanor knew that what she had just done would not only change one life, but potentially an entire system. She gazed into Finch's eyes, the man she had once seen as an insurmountable wall to justice, then spoke softly, her voice steady. No one can outrun justice, not even the most powerful. Her words echoed throughout the room, not just as a warning to Finch, but as a reminder to all who were listening. Justice cannot be bought, it cannot be swayed, and it cannot be defeated. No matter how much power, money, or influence one has, in the end, all must face the truth. Eleanor didn't need any further explanations or justifications. She turned and walked out of the room, each step more resolute than the last. This was not the end, but a new beginning, the start of a longer, harder struggle to continue defending justice. And no matter how much wealth, power, or connections Finch had, at this moment, he was nothing more than a broken man, powerless to change the truth. Eleanor's office was no longer the quiet sanctuary it once was. She and the FBI were deep into a tense, high-stakes investigation. After exposing Finch, Eleanor knew she couldn't stop. Finch was just one piece of a much larger criminal network. A new door had opened, and the co-conspirators were starting to be exposed. Standing before a large map filled with connecting wires, Eleanor marked names, cases, and the links between various judges and Liberty Fund. The details were becoming clearer by the minute. This system was not just about Finch. Behind him, there were other names, judges, powerful officials within the judicial system, all wrapped up in a sophisticated network of corruption where money and politics were exchanged in place of justice. One of the FBI investigators pushed a file across the table, revealing the names of more judges with huge financial transfers from Liberty Fund to their accounts. One of the prominent names was Judge Marcus Thorne, who had presided over a series of cases with decisions clearly favoring conservative organizations and large corporations. Step by step, case by case, these individuals were being paid off with money and power rather than serving justice. We found 3 more judges linked to transactions with Liberty Fund, an FBI agent said, his eyes tense yet determined. Judge Thorne is at the helm of one of the key cases we need to investigate. The financial transactions from these organizations are altering the entire landscape of their cases. Eleanor didn't take her eyes off the documents. Her resolve remained unwavering. Each piece of evidence felt like a slash against a justice system manipulated by the powerful, those who had traded the truth for personal gain. Her hand clenched, not from anxiety but from a fierce determination to never stop. These criminals would pay, and she would be the one to expose them all. Finch is just a small part of this network, Eleanor said, her voice strong and fearless. This system is larger than we thought, but we will not stop until all these corrupt individuals are exposed. She flipped through more of the new documents. More judges were revealed. They weren't just facing one corrupt judge, they were up against a whole system, a group of powerful people manipulating justice. But Eleanor knew that now, with each step she and the FBI took, the path to the truth was widening, and no one could stop it. A major investigation had begun, with FBI agents digging into every document, every transaction, searching for the traces these judges had left behind. And the deeper they went, the clearer the evidence became. Finch had been nothing more than a pawn in a larger game these people had set up. But now, they couldn't escape the watchful eyes of justice and the truth. After exposing part of the corrupt network with Finch as a key link, Eleanor felt she could not stop. She knew that each victory was just the beginning, and to truly defeat the enemy, she needed to understand more about Finch's past, what he had done, who he had deceived. Eleanor spent hours poring over Finch's records, looking for any clue that could lead to the truth. What she uncovered shocked her to the core. Finch wasn't just a powerful judge. He had been responsible for the suffering of countless innocent people. Gradually, the documents began to reveal dark secrets. Finch wasn't a successful judge because of his talent, but because of his shady connections and unethical deals. The cases he had handled weren't about protecting justice, but about serving his own interests and those of the powerful forces behind him. One of the discoveries made Eleanor stop dead in her tracks, paralyzed by the brutal truth. Finch had been the only person who could save a group of families trapped in a land dispute where a powerful corporation tried to seize their property. But instead of standing up for justice, Finch betrayed them, ruling in favor of the corporation in exchange for a large sum of money from secret funds. One of the victims in this case, Sarah Miller, a mother of 3 children, could no longer bear the loss and humiliation after being betrayed by Finch. She took her own life, a tragedy that many would never know about. Eleanor's anger surged, but she didn't allow herself to be consumed by it. She understood that to break this system, she had to keep her emotions in check. As she dug deeper, Eleanor uncovered another story. Finch had refused to handle a traffic accident case where an innocent man had been wrongfully convicted, simply because the person responsible for the accident was a friend of a powerful official. Finch's ruling sent the man to prison while the real criminal was protected thanks to connections and secret meetings. The man had spent 6 years in prison before the truth came to light. Eleanor could not accept this. The victims Finch had abandoned, the lives destroyed because of power and money, all of it fueled a stronger resolve within her than ever before. Finch had to pay, but she also knew he wasn't the only one responsible. The entire rotten system needed to be changed. Eleanor wouldn't allow herself to stop at just facing Finch. She had to dig deeper and continue exposing the co-conspirators in this web of deceit. This was no time to falter because Eleanor knew Finch was only a small part of a much larger network. Eleanor's office was now overflowing with documents, copies of financial transactions, emails, and audio recordings that she and the FBI had gathered. Each piece of evidence was slowly but surely piecing together a complete picture of a judicial system that had been manipulated, where justice was no longer justice but a tool used to serve personal interests. Eleanor sat in front of her computer, her eyes fixed on the screen, when an FBI agent handed her a thick file. These were the latest pieces of evidence gathered from other judges in the system, individuals who had taken bribes from organizations like Liberty Fund. The agent pointed to a section of the file where a series of large sums had been transferred into the account of another judge, David Chun, who had issued rulings favoring large corporations in environmental lawsuits. "We've got enough evidence now, Eleanor," the FBI agent said, his voice full of resolve. Not just Finch. Now we can indict a whole slew of other judges. Eleanor sighed, a sense of exhaustion creeping over her. But the exhilaration was just as powerful. This was a major breakthrough in the investigation. They weren't just exposing Finch's corruption. They were expanding the case to include the entire judicial system, where those in power had distorted justice for personal gain. Finch was just a small cog, Eleanor said, her voice as sharp as ever. Now we go after the entire system and expose all those who've corrupted justice. She stood up, not hesitating for a second, her determination radiating from her eyes in each step she took. A quick meeting was called between Eleanor and the FBI team. Everyone understood that this wasn't going to be an easy battle. The corrupt judges weren't just powerful individuals. They were backed by a vast network of organizations and politicians protecting them. However, Eleanor and the FBI now had enough evidence to prosecute these judges for bribery and the distortion of the law. We won't stop here, Eleanor said during the meeting, her voice resolute. This is our one chance to clean up this system, and we must act now. She pulled out a map showing the relationships between the judges and conservative organizations, highlighting the hidden connections and backdoor dealings that had been covered up before. The names of judges, the manipulated cases, they were all starting to be revealed through irrefutable evidence. We'll start with the judges in the system, but we won't stop with them, Eleanor continued, a comprehensive attack plan now in place. We're going to clean up the system. The atmosphere in the room became more tense than ever, but Eleanor knew she couldn't back down. She had come too far, and nothing would stop this fight. Today, they weren't just defeating one criminal. They were taking down a massive corrupt system, one that very few had the courage to challenge. After all the challenges and tireless efforts, Eleanor Vance had become a symbol of justice. Images of her flooded the news, social media, and TV screens, capturing her story of fighting against corruption. She was no longer just a person standing up against the system, but an embodiment of resilience, determination, and inner strength. Scenes of people crowding squares, waving flags and banners with Eleanor's name in bold, showed their respect and admiration for the woman who had dared to stand up for the oppressed. Reporters clamored for interviews, and Eleanor never hesitated to share her long, difficult, but inspiring journey. Her victories in the cases she fought had turned Eleanor into a beacon of hope, not just for those deceived by the justice system, but for anyone who still believed in justice in the darkest of times. But Eleanor didn't stop here. She had begun a larger journey, fighting not only for herself, but for all innocent people, those trampled by corruption. Though she was hailed as a hero by the media, Eleanor never lost sight of the reason she started this fight, because of those who couldn't defend themselves. Eleanor appeared in a live national television interview watched by millions. The studio lights were bright, but the look in Eleanor's eyes was filled with seriousness and determination. After all that had transpired, she stood and spoke with an unmistakable voice. We cannot allow corruption and injustice to control our lives. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink into the minds of everyone listening. Eleanor wasn't just talking about the failure of one system. She was calling on people to stand up for justice, to stand up for the victims who had been deceived. We must protect the values we believe in, even if we face powerful forces, even if we walk through bloodstained paths. Justice is not something that comes naturally. It is something we must fight for. Her call echoed like a powerful wave of inspiration, spreading across the country. Eleanor's words made millions feel they weren't alone in their fight, that if they dared to stand up, they would never face injustice alone again. The story concludes with an image of Eleanor with her family. After all the hardships, sleepless nights, and moments when it seemed like everything could be lost, she was sitting next to her husband and young daughter, looking ahead. The light of dawn illuminated the room, but it wasn't just sunlight. It was the light of truth and justice she had helped bring to life. Today is a victory, Eleanor said to her husband, her voice full of pride, but also a hint of melancholy. But the battle is not over. There is still so much justice that needs to be protected. Her husband took her hand, his gaze full of understanding, but also unwavering trust in Eleanor's abilities. They didn't need to say anything more. Both knew that their journey would never end. Eleanor held her head high, her eyes filled with determination, as if looking toward a future full of hope, but also full of challenges. She knew the road ahead would be long, and many more struggles lay ahead. But one thing was certain: she would never give up on justice. And in that moment, Eleanor was not only a warrior for justice, but a symbol of faith in the higher values humanity can protect, no matter how difficult the battle may be.